How are you doing?
Very well.
Now you're living here in Arizona.
Living here in Arizona, married a couple of years ago. We're very
Wonderful.
happy here.
Congratulations. Well, we talk about the imperialism.
Okay.
But first of all, if you please define what imperialism means.
Well, imperialism covers wide range. Basically, it means the capacity to control and dominate what others do in one form or another. Sometimes it can be with extreme violence, say like the invasion of Iraq. Sometimes it can be through financial manipulations, like encouraging capital flight or imposing structural adjustment programs. And sometimes it can be kidnapping the president, as in Haiti a couple of years ago. Many different forms, but essentially it means the ability to coerce and control and to get away with it, not to be even censured, let alone punished. That's very critical.
Sometimes through free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, etc.
Well, there's treaties, and then there's my friend Edward Herman, who we were just talking about, made a distinction between worthy and unworthy victims. The unworthy victims have to obey the treaty obligations. The worthy ones do what they like.
Professor, the world geopolitics of the 21st century is characterized by the resurgence of Russia and China as a new economic power, China. Will the United States remain the hegemon of international order?
Well, actually, if you take a look at the post-World War II period, the peak of U.S. power was actually in 1945. At that point, the U.S. had probably something like half the world's wealth. It had incredible security, controlled the whole Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, had a unparalleled military and nuclear weapons. That's a degree of domination of the world for which there's absolutely no historical precedent. But it began to erode very quickly. In 1949, an event took place which, interestingly, is known in the United States as the loss of China, which is a very interesting phrase. I can lose my computer. I can't lose your computer. But the presupposition is we own the world, and if someone becomes independent, we've lost it. And the loss of China had an enormous impact domestically. It led to the huge, what's called McCarthyist repression. It had an enormous effect on foreign policy. When Kennedy, for example, was considering whether to escalate the U.S. attack on, at that point, South Vietnam, later all of Indochina, one of his concerns was that he might be blamed for the loss of Indochina, not ours if we don't control it. And in fact, if you look over the period, 1945 to the present, the U.S. power has consistently declined. But there's another factor that isn't measured usually by economists or political scientists. U.S. power in the international system as a national entity has declined. But meanwhile, the world has changed under neoliberal globalization. And if you look at ownership of the world, U.S. corporations, international, multinational corporations based in the United States, have about 50% ownership of the world economy. Their U.S. corporations are first in almost every category, manufacturing, finance, commerce, just about everything. So while national power has, by a certain measure, declined, in another respect, the outreach of U.S.-based economic and therefore political power is still enormous. And of course, in military terms, the U.S. is just nowhere else even close. The U.S. spends almost as much as most of the rest of the world combined. It's technologically vastly more advanced, has maybe 800 or 900 military bases around the world, not in Manta, but it has them. I'll never forget your comment about that, which was wonderful, repeated all the time. But Ecuador doesn't have a base in Miami. And in fact, practically no other country has anything remotely like this. So I think China is undoubtedly a dynamic, growing economy, and it'll play a major role in world affairs, but it's still a pretty poor country.
Yes.
If you take the Human Development Index of the United Nations, I think China is maybe 90th or so, has enormous internal problems, ecological, demographic, political repression, lots of problems internally that the more developed industrial countries don't have.
Now you mentioned, Professor, the United States exerts unprecedented military power in the world, and according to Donald Trump, under his government, this power will become greater, better, and stronger. What is the military strategy of the U.S. in the hands of Donald Trump?
Well, actually, it's quite the opposite. Under Trump, it's becoming weaker, less effective. It's internally disintegrating. It's losing its whatever international authority and prestige it had. And it's also moving to destroy the world. The most important policy of the Trump administration, by far, is its approach towards a real existential crisis, climate change. Here, the United States under Trump has departed from the entire world. Every other country has at least some kind of commitment to addressing this growing and, in fact, imminent crisis. The United States alone, under Trump, is not only pulled out of these efforts, but is aggressively moving to increase the danger, to escalate it by greater concentration on fossil fuel extraction and use. The United States is now displacing Saudi Arabia as the leading fossil fuel producer. And this is devastating.
I understand that, but how can you get the United States to sign, for instance, the ecological treaties, no? If it has such a great military power, you know?
It has, certainly the United States has the capacity to destroy everything. That's not in question. But so does every other leading nuclear power. I mean, we have to understand that we've reached a point where a nuclear confrontation between major powers would essentially destroy the species. I mean, a first strike by any major power would destroy the country that carried it out, simply because of the likely effects of nuclear winter, posing a famine for decades, maybe centuries. We've reached a level of destruction which is just beyond imagination. That happened a long time ago. And right now, in fact, it's getting more dangerous. That's why if you take a look at the Doomsday Clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was established in 1947, every year leading scientists, nuclear scientists, political analysts, and others try to evaluate the threat to the world. And they set the minute hand of the Doomsday Clock a certain number of minutes from midnight. Midnight means termination for the species and many other species. It started in 1947, 7 minutes to midnight. It has oscillated since. Once it reached 2 minutes to midnight. That was 1953, when the United States and later the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, which have the capacity to destroy everything very quickly. Then it's moved up and back. It's now, just a couple of weeks ago, moved back to 2 minutes to midnight, closest it's been to terminal destruction since it was established.
Quite interesting, Professor. Professor, the 20th century was the bloodiest in world history. However, you have argued that the world faces a greater threat from the terrifying nuclear arsenals of countries. Can the rhetoric of war between the United States and North Korea materialize in a war with unpredictable consequences?
Could very easily. And in this case, there happens to be a very feasible approach to dealing with the crisis. And it's pretty well known. It's a Chinese proposal which has been on the table for years. It's been supported by Russia, supported by most of the world. North Korea has indicated some potential support for it, and it makes very good sense. The proposal is for what's called a double freeze. North Korea freezes its development of weapons and nuclear and missile developments. It freezes them, and the United States calls off the constant, highly threatening military maneuvers on North Korea's border. And the United States, the most advanced U.S. aircraft, B-1, B-52s, nuclear-capable aircraft, are constantly flying near the North Korean border. That's a severe threat. Now, they're going back to treaties. There is something called the UN Charter, which bans the threat or use of force. Threat or use of force. This is in strict violation of the Charter. It's a crime. And it's happening all the time. And if you look at the history of the United States and North Korea, it's a very meaningful threat. The United States practically flattened the country back in the 1950s. So the United States calls off those threats, and North Korea freezes its weapons development. That could set the stage for negotiations which could deal with the conflict and crisis in a sensible and constructive way. I mean, whatever one thinks about the North Korean government, say you think it's the worst government in history, it doesn't matter. It is widely understood that the government is trying to move towards economic development, and has had some success in that, in fact. But the weapons programs and the constant threat of confrontation are an enormous burden which prevent that. So they have every reason to want to enter into some sort of settlement that would ease the tensions and permit economic development and possibly moves towards unification. And if you look at the history of negotiations, they indicate, contrary to a lot of propaganda, they indicate that there are many possibilities.
Well, Professor, the main subject of this conversation is imperialism. But let's talk about some internal American problems that they are problems also for the rest of humanity, you know. For instance, violence. Violence is one of the biggest problems of U.S. society. How do we solve this problem? Why do we not do the obvious, such as gun control?
Well, that's an internal problem in the United States, and it's a real cultural and social pathology. Gun-related deaths in the United States are about 25 times as high as comparable countries. In fact, any country that's not at war, like Syria, 25 times as high. And there's a widespread, I can't even call it belief, a kind of passion in the United States claiming that we have a divine right to carry an assault rifle into a coffee shop if we want to have coffee. Where did that come from? There's a lot of talk about the sacred obligations of the Second Amendment of the Constitution. You know when that began? 2008. It's not in American history. I mean, the Second Amendment is there, but it became a kind of a divine right with a Supreme Court decision in 2008, D.C., Washington, D.C. v. Heller, which is a very interesting decision. And it's kind of interesting not only in itself, but the way it's dealt with in the legal profession. This decision was very narrow. It dealt with an extremely narrow issue. You look at the Second Amendment, it says, in order to maintain a well-ordered militia, individuals should have the right to bear arms. And the debate was about whether that means that the right to bear arms is conditioned on the establishment of a militia, or whether it's an individual right independent of a militia. That's the debate. And the decision by Justice Scalia, highly respected scholar, a so-called originalist, who says we have to pay attention to the intentions of the signer, the founders, the people who established the law. His decision was that it's an individual right, not conditioned on the militia. And then there's debate in the legal profession. Is it a militia? Is it not? It's all totally irrelevant. If you look back at the intentions of the founders, like an authentic originalist, why did they want people to have guns? Very simple. To kill Indians and to control slaves. Why did they need a militia? Because the British are coming. Does any of that hold? First of all, quite apart from what that means about the history, does any of that apply today? No. Second Amendment has no applicability. These discussions are totally irrelevant to the facts, and they're very revealing, because if you ask, why did the settlers need guns? Yeah, it's true, they had to maintain control of the slave population in the most vicious system of slavery in human history, and they had to expand over the continent and exterminate the population. That's why they needed guns. So there's an interesting lesson in the Second Amendment if you pay some attention to it. But what's discussed is almost totally irrelevant, almost completely irrelevant. And that's what established the 2008 decision, reversed about 100 years of a judicial opinion that held that it's not an individual right, but it's connected to a militia.
Well, let's talk about the relationship between United States and Latin America, Professor. You know, I come from Latin America. With the rise of right-wing governments in Latin America, where are U.S. and Latin American relations heading?
Well, for one thing, the achievements of the so-called pink tide have not been overcome. So, for example, there are no U.S. military bases. There's military, a level of military intervention, but there's no direct military bases. More interestingly still, the IMF, which is a branch of the U.S. Treasury Department pretty much, has been pretty much thrown out of the continent. IMF loans.
They are coming back.
They're trying to come back, but notice that just as the military is trying to come back, but that's different from what it was. The days when the U.S. could just overthrow a government anytime it felt like it, that's gone. They can do things like supporting the military coup in Honduras, but it's nothing like instituting a military dictatorship in Brazil, the biggest country in the hemisphere. They can steal, they can back the stealing of an election, that kind of thing. But it's nothing like what it was not long ago. The terror in Central America in the 1980s, which is a horror story, the U.S. supporting terrorist armies in every country of the region, or when they didn't control the army, guerrillas attacking the country, then they can't do that anymore. So yes, there have been gains, also social and internal gains. There's regression, a lot of problems, but I think there have been solid accomplishments.
I disagree a little bit with you, Professor, because I think there are another method, but well, they can overthrow governments, still overthrow governments in Latin America. For instance, to use mass media in order to destabilize any government.
They can destabilize government, but that's quite different than instituting a military coup, as was done with impunity for years, ever since, I mean, without going back over the past history, just in the post-war period, things like coup in Guatemala, the plague of repression that spread through Latin America from the early 60s, right ending up in Central America in the 80s. That's beyond the power of the United States now.
But for instance, how do you evaluate the policy of the United States towards Venezuela? There are many international stakeholders in Venezuela, like Russia and China. They have important interests there. And Colombia, a major military ally of the U.S., is neighbor of Venezuela. Can you imagine a similar scenario like Syria in Venezuela?
I don't think so. I mean, Venezuela has very serious problems, but the United States, I don't think, is in the position to institute a military coup or to attack, to use military force to attack the country. I think that's highly unlikely. The U.S. just doesn't have that power or support anymore. It wouldn't even have OAS support, which it used to have.
Professor, on a separate note, the United Kingdom does not allow Julian Assange to leave the embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy in London, our embassy. Do you believe that this is due to pressure from the United States for his extradition?
The U.S. hasn't said explicitly that they're going to call for his extradition, but I think it's generally assumed that if he leaves the embassy, he'll end up in a Guantanamo.
I am quite sure of that, you know. Well, last topic, Professor, about my region, Latin America. You know, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. You can find there people extreme rich and people extreme poor. Of course, this is a distribution problem, no lack of resources. We have no resources, but the problem is distribution. And technically, well, we have the solution for this. For instance, more progressive tax systems.
Yeah.
Financing...
Or even collecting the taxes.
Yes, and collecting them. Financing public expenditure, giving equal opportunities to everybody. For instance, public education, public health, etc. Controlling market power, respecting labor rights, better distribution of national resources. The problem is not a technical one. The problem is a political one, because that will harm the elites that always dominated us. So, but these elites own the means of production, the mass media. So, any government trying to solve this problem will be under attack.
Be under attack, but the attacks can be beaten back. I mean, there has actually been progress. Like take extension of educational possibilities. I mean, that's changed. So in Brazil, for example, where my wife is from, under the Lula government, there was much broader participation of wide sectors of the population in the educational
Where is Lula right now?
Well, that's a struggle.
You know what is happening there.
Things don't come easily. You have to keep struggling. And it's striking that he's by far the most popular figure in the country. They're trying to block him from participation in the election. But 30 years ago, the U.S. would have just installed a military dictatorship. Okay, things have changed.
My last question, Professor. If you, Professor, were an honest Latin American political leader, how would you deal with this problem?
Well, the way you were doing in Ecuador, the way Lula was doing in Brazil, I mean, the way Morales has done in Bolivia. Many flaws, you know, not claiming anything near perfection. There were all sorts of things that were wrong. So take Brazil again, the most important country. Lula never succeeded and never seriously tried to change the basis of the economy from raw material export to real development, internal development. It was quite different from East Asia in that respect, where they did the opposite. There was enormous corruption. But these things can be overcome, and that's the task to carry out.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. As usual, it has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Good to talk
I
to
hope
you.
to see you soon.